Thank you. Thank you, Richard and the committee, for inviting me. I feel like a bit of an interloper as a scholar, and I don't want to be in the position of being in the way of our partaking of the wonderful art that's going to be shown after this talk and for the next couple of days. I'm really thrilled to be here. I was not here last year, but thanks to this wonderful committee, or whoever on that committee was most responsible, I was able to experience a little bit of what happened last year vicariously through the anthology that they put together and conveniently marketed on Amazon.com called the Kimball Challenge. I was really impressed with the scholarship and the eloquence of the writers, but what I came away with after reading all those essays was a set of images, a set of scenes that to me were very compelling. Of Terrell Gibbons working every morning with his axe and mattock in the woods behind his house in rural Virginia, imitating, as he said, the great gardener, cultivating and nurturing and unfolding a beauteous cosmic garden. Very impressive line in his keynote address, although he admitted that what Fiona, his wife, had in mind was he was going to transform this scruffy backyard into something like Darcy's Park in Pride and Prejudice. I was moved by the image of Kristen Hagland sitting in semi-darkness after a blackout turned her stake conference dark, and they continued the meeting with flashlights, and she sat shivering at the sound of the choir, and especially at the moment where the male section began to whistle. I was impressed with Jared Hickman writing about eating off John Benyon's pottery, feeling health in his navel and marrow in his bones, and attesting that he felt with Joseph Smith that sort of experience was something after the order of the Son of God. In other words, to borrow from Jared Hickman's title of his essay, last year's conference was art all the way down, which is a great relief to me because I am someone who collects pottery, thinks about ordinary textiles, and thinks about the common experiences of poetry and music in people's lives in time past. I was also struck with another scene that came from Eric Samuelson, who described the hard luck of dramatist Tim Slover, who was marketing a screenplay in which the main character was William Shakespeare at the same time that Miramax was producing the film Shakespeare in Love. And then more recently, as he tried to market a play about Alexander Hamilton a few months before a rather well-known hip-hop musical took off. So Samuelson reminded us, and as did other speakers, of the importance of patrons and producers and publishers and readers who can embrace the work that artists do. Therefore, I was rather amazed at Jana Reese, who said that she reads, on average, one sci-fi or fantasy novel a week. Hooray for Jana. She may have something to do with the prominence, as she talks about, of genre fiction among Mormon writers. So I was not, however, here to really experience the music or the paintings or the performances. And I'm very much looking forward to doing that this weekend. But it seemed to me that Jana, not in her formal presentation, but in a blog post that she wrote during the actual conference, really hits a common theme that I heard over and over again, and it was invoked already today, and that is the theme of community. And Jana said, community is the Mormon Shakespeare. The lone genius paradigm is not our jam. I thought about that a lot, and I thought about that in relation to things that I know pretty well and into things that I care about a lot. And what I'm going to do for a few minutes here is share some of those things. I'm going to share an excerpt from my own recent book on 19th century Mormonism, and then 2 or 3 pieces from writers I admire. And I'm going to try a little bit in my own thinking, and I invite you to think about it as well, about that notion of community being the genius of Mormon art. This event really exemplifies that. Something about being able to pull together to create something powerful that no one single genius could do. But I'm also wanting to think hard about the importance of the lone person who may not fit well in the community or may feel that he or she does not, and try to develop a little bit some of the tension between these concepts of the lonely journey that art sometimes takes us, as well as the community spirit that can bring things together in new ways. So let me start with an object that probably some of you have heard me talk about and want me to move on to something else. But it's very important to me. And this is an artifact that was discovered and brought together by Carol Nielsen, who was a docent at the Church Museum, when she inherited half of this quilt and then managed to go out and find the other half. It had been separated in the 1890s, and miraculously both halves survived, and she brought them together and did a wonderful book of genealogy through the University of Utah Press, and then kindly shared with me all of the photographs that her husband had taken of this quilt, and was not at all put out that I took this quilt on as a historical project and tried to carry it a little bit further into the analytical mode. So the 14th Ward album quilt was made in 1857 in Salt Lake City by 64 women in a newly reconstituted Relief Society organization with Phoebe Woodruff as the president of the organization. And it was what is called a hot pad quilt. That is, the women made their squares and stuffed them and quilted them. And then later, some genius managed to link them all together with that blue sashing into this magnificent, really almost king-size quilt when the 2 pieces were together. Talk about an example of community. The individual pieces are very, very different. It is in the pattern, a well-known 19th century phenomenon called the album quilt, like an album where each person puts an inscription. Each square is signed by the person who made it, but the squares are all different. There's no common pattern, no attempt to totally harmonize the different skill sets or design patterns. So we have this square from Maine, perfectly pieced, mariner's compass, precise, precise, precise. And then we have Sarah Ann Church's cucumber in all the stages of gestation, from blossom to fully ripe yellow, a freehand rendition that comes straight out of her experience as gardener. We have the passionate patriotism of Annette or a Cummings with the eagle, and we have a strong testimony and, like 100 and something tiny pieces put together by Lenora Taylor. Each of these squares individual and powerful. And when they are brought together, we have this magnificent work of art that is interesting in its individual pieces and very powerful as a composite. Now, the thing that I think is interesting as a historian, when we talk about Mormon community, we sometimes imagine people have lived for generations in some little Utah town. That is not what we're talking about here. These women, the first of them, had arrived less than 10 years before this quilt was made, and they came from many, many different places. Of the 34 quilters that came from the United States, 13 were born in New England, 9 in the Mid-Atlantic, 7 in the Midwest, and 5 in the South. And there were 20 quilters born in England, another 5 from Scotland, and 1 each from Wales, Canada, and Switzerland. There is a common European or Euro-American heritage, but in this era, that is diversity. That is embracing immigrants alongside those who were native-born Americans, embracing those who were new converts along those who had been with the church since Kirtland. And really, looking at birthplaces doesn't really tell the story. Phoebe Pratt left her rural Long Island home to work as a tailoress in New York City before migrating to Nauvoo, Illinois. By 1850, she was a plural wife of Apostle Parley Pratt, and on her way to San Francisco, then Chile, in Valparaiso, she gave birth to her second child, and then back in the 14th Ward, participating in the Alban quilt. Wilmarth East, born in Georgia, moved with her family to Texas when she was 12. Then, after marrying a former Texas Ranger, lived in Kansas before migrating to Utah in 1855. And my favorite, Josephine Marie Augustine de la Harpe Ludert, identified as Josephine Richards on her square, was born in Switzerland to a family of diplomats and educated in St. Petersburg, where she met and married a German who was serving as the Tsar's consul in Havana. After her husband died, she returned to Switzerland and alternately flirted with Catholicism and French socialism before becoming a Latter-day Saint. This is community 19th century Mormon style. And Eliza R. Snow, in one of her poems, expressed the ethic. What fascinated me about this quilt, there's only one square that alludes to national original origin. It's a square with a thistle, and the woman was born in Scotland. But Eliza writes, "For none I cherish a partiality. I'm not Italian, Hindu, English, German, Scot, neither American, Swiss, Welsh, or Dane, nor any islander from ocean's main, nor Spanish, French, Norwegian, nor Swede. I claim no country, nation, kingdom, creed, excepting Zion. This I proudly name. This is the home I fondly love to claim." So this album quilt, I could go on and on, also has a kind of metaphorical power. As travelers came and looked over the Salt Lake Valley on a good year, They saw streams of water like rivers, the little irrigation ditches that demarcated the plots with flowers and trees, much as the blue sashing on this quilt outlines the strongly floral symbolism of the quilt. The quilt exemplifies the biblical scripture, part of which is written on a couple of squares, that the desert will blossom as a rose. So inspiring, wonderful, a great kind of model of Mormon art coming together with different talents and creating something new, not only as a physical object, but as an experience, and as a kind of welding and bonding together, as we have in our scriptures, of humanity together as children of heavenly parents. But if we look harder at this, and I'm going to turn now to two contemporary writers, and I'm going to think about this quilt as a landscape in relation to the actual physical landscape of the Intermountain West. And I'm thinking here of an amazing contribution in Mormon art, from my point of view, breaking boundaries of genre. And that is the book by Terry Tempest Williams called Refuge. How many of you in the room have read Terry Tempest Williams' Refuge? Not as many as I would hope have read this book. It was published in 1991, and some of you weren't born yet. But it's certainly had a very powerful, ongoing presence, and is often considered an exemplary work of Mormon literature. The plot of this book is a memoir. It's a creative nonfiction, a beautiful example of that genre. It's a story about a moment when the Great Salt Lake, it's hard to imagine today, had too much water. It flooded, even came and flooded part of the city. And what it did that was so devastating to Terry Tempest Williams, who was working as a naturalist, was threaten the existence of the Bear River National Migratory Bird Refuge. She was a birder and a naturalist working at the University of Utah. And at the same time as this water came, and just out of control, no one knowing what to do or how to handle it or how far it was going to go, her mother was dying of cancer. And what she did in this book was to bring together those two different powerful stories in alternating voices for a profound meditation on mortality and nature and spirituality. And she makes a very interesting comment. I am not adjusting. I keep dreaming the refuge back to what I have known. Rich green bulrushes that border the wetlands, herons hidden behind cattails, concentric circles of ducks on ponds. I blow on these images like the last burning embers on a winter's night. And she, in a pivotal passage, section in the book, a profound and controversial to some readers passage, she goes to the absolute depths and takes herself out alone. Here now is where the lone genius comes in, the bereft artist trying to come to terms with something she had not comprehended and cannot deal with. And she goes out onto the salt flats alone, not knowing what will happen. If the desert is holy, it is because it is a forgotten place that allows us to remember the sacred. Perhaps that is why every pilgrimage to the desert is a pilgrimage to the self. There is no place to hide, and so we are found. In the severity of the salt desert, I am brought down to my knees by its beauty. My imagination is fired, my heart opens, and my skin burns in the passion of these moments. I will have no other gods before me. Now that phrase, I recently had an experience of leading a seminar on refuge at the Harvard Divinity School, where Terry Tempest Williams was in residence this last year. And they had a seminar on each of her major works. And I had the privilege of being able to lead the discussion on that. And one of the faculty members at the Divinity School pointed to that paragraph, and he read it. I will have no other gods before me. The full and complete self-assertion of the lone genius. I read it, I will have no other gods before me, in terms of the experience of the desert. And I think my reading is justified, because what she does, she goes on and she talks about the Christ in the wilderness, Joseph Smith in the grove of trees. And she said, I believe their sojourns into nature were sacred, are ours any less. And then she quotes, and maybe I can read it because I think it's beautiful, and I think it explains a point of view that's really powerful and important in a setting such as this. She quotes from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. The earth rolls upon her wings, and the sun giveth his light by day, and the moon giveth her light by night. And the stars also give their light as they roll upon their wings in their glory in the midst of the power of God. Unto what shall I liken these kingdoms, that ye may understand? Behold, all these are kingdoms, and any man who has seen any or the least of these has seen God moving in his majesty and power. And then she writes, I pray to the birds. I pray to the birds because I believe they will carry the message of my heart upward. I pray to them because I believe in their existence, the way their songs begin and end each day, the invocation and benedictions of earth. I pray to the birds because they remind me of what I love rather than what I fear. And at the end of my prayers, they teach me how to listen. I recommend that book. How else could we look at this quilt? The flowering of community in contrast to the loneliness of the desert. There might be another way to think about that. The 14th Ward album quilt was made in 1857. And during the months that the women were assembling the quilt, Johnson's army embarked from the east and was marching toward Utah. And men were buckling on swords, and there was panic and terror about what was going to happen. And as that quilt was completed and was hung in the Deseret Agricultural Fair and won a prize, John D. Lee arrived in Salt Lake City to tell Brigham Young that Indians had massacred more than 200 settlers going south, telling a story that was a lie, a story of terror that we now know was a story of extreme violence by people who feared and forgot what they loved and acted out in violence. So I would like to invite you to think about another recent work of Mormon literature. How many of you have read Educated? I recommend this. This is a fabulous book published in February 2018, and it's in the same genre as Refuge, that is creative nonfiction. It's a memoir. It's a memoir by Tara Westover, who's from Idaho, like me. So I immediately wanted to connect with Tara Westover. Tara Westover grew up, she was born in, she thinks, sometime, I guess she knows the year, 1986, but her family did not keep birth records. She has no birth certificate in Idaho because she was born to a family of survivalists, Mormon survivalists, who dug into the mountain to prepare for the second coming of Jesus or the FBI, whichever came first. And her father was convinced it would soon be the FBI. She was not allowed to attend school. She was not allowed to make friends with people who were not part of their narrow circle. She grew up working in her father's scrapyard under incredibly dangerous situations. And she experienced incredible psychological abuse from a very, very controlling father, and physical abuse from a brother who was obviously deeply disturbed. This is a story that has captured the imagination of people all over the United States and has been on the New York Times bestseller list for some time and was the book of choice for the New York Times PBS Book Club recently. And the amazing thing about this story is how she got out of this situation. Starting at the age of 11, trying to reach out in some ways. And then eventually, this is a good Mormon story. She attends a Mormon ward. They're somewhat isolated from that Mormon ward. But the beginning of her escape is through the arts. Her mother allows her to join a little dance class in her small town at the foot of a mountain in southern Idaho. When the mother tells the dance teacher, no exposed arms and legs. She has to be completely covered. The kind dance teacher creates a costume that imitates the sweatshirt that Tara has been wearing to dance class. Nevertheless, when her father goes to the performance, finds out what's going on, he's furious, and her mother backs away, and she no longer can go to the dance class. But the mother sees something that needs cultivating in this little girl. And she finds a way for her to study voice and to take some voice lessons from someone who lives in the small settlement. And so, as would happen in many Mormon communities, she's invited to sing in church. Mother's fingers hovered over the keys. The pause had become awkward. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. I thought of the voices, of their strange contradictions, of the way they made sound float on the air, of how that sound was soft like a warm wind, but so sharp it pierced. She had been listening to her brother had given her his old boombox, and it had a tabernacle choir recording. And these are the voices she remembers as she stands in front of the congregation. I reached for those voices, reached into my mind, and there they were. Nothing had ever felt so natural. It was as if I thought the sound, and by thinking, it brought it into being. But reality had never yielded to my thoughts before. The song finished, and I returned to our pew. A prayer was offered to close the service. Then the crowd rushed me. Women in floral print smiled and clasped my hand. Men in square black suits clapped my shoulder. The choir director invited me to join the choir. Brother Davis asked me to sing for the Rotary Club, and the bishop said he'd like me to sing my song at a funeral, and I said yes to all of them. Dad smiled at everyone. There was scarcely a person in the church that Dad hadn't called a Gentile for visiting a doctor or for sending their kids to the public school. But that day, he seemed to forget about California socialism and the Illuminati. She told me I had lunch with her today, and she told me it really was the Gadiat and Roberts, not the Illuminati. He stood next to me, a hand on my shoulder, graciously collecting compliments. "We're very blessed," he kept saying, "very blessed." Papa J crossed the chapel and paused in front of our view. This is Papa J, whom Dad can't stand. He's come from Seattle to try to change the community. Papa J said I sang like one of God's own angels. Dad looked at him for a moment, then his eyes began to shine, and he shook Papa J's hand like they were old friends. The story doesn't end there, but it's a moment of grace. Only when she sang did the warmth and love and admiration of her father come out in her life. But it was a very, very long struggle, a physical struggle, damaging. It's amazing she survived. Reading the book, those of you who read it, I kept saying, no, as I read it. It's not deliberately sensational. It's very close to the bone as you read this controlling, perhaps paranoid parent and his terror of having his daughter succumb to the ways of the world. And her brother constantly calls her a whore because she might wear a short sleeve or smile at a boy at the gas station. She has a brother who's escaped this environment by studying on his own and passing the ACT. And he said, "Tara, if you want to get out of here, that's what you've got to do. You got to teach yourself enough to pass that exam." And she did. And she got to BYU, an amazing part of the story, which we don't have time for here. And she won a scholarship to Cambridge University and completed her PhD. It's a rags to riches story. It's a captivity narrative story. It's a story about survival. It's a story about forgiveness and grace. It's a story that's told in some passages explicitly, but mostly told through close attention to what may appear the minutiae of her daily life and bringing to full forth the character, the internal struggle of a family that for her own psychic and physical survival, she eventually has to confront the violence and the abuse that she's lived through. And this is how she describes that. In addition to music, one of the healing things in her life is the mountain. That the junkyard is on the side of the mountain, but the mountain is beautiful, and she can escape into the mountain, and she can dream of other things through the mountain. And so she's, at long last, through many trials, she has completed her PhD, interestingly enough, in history. And this is how she writes. I had built a new life, and it was a happy one, but I felt a sense of loss that went beyond family. I had lost Buck's Peak, the mountain, not by leaving, but by leaving silently. I had retreated, fled across an ocean, and allowed my father to tell my story for me, to define me to everyone I had ever known. I had conceded too much ground, not just the mountain, but the entire province of our shared history. And so she wrote her story. She wrote her story so that she could heal and forgive her father. But of course that meant she may never see him again because she was completely cut off by her father and her mother. But not by, fortunately, 3 of her siblings who validated her story and have become close to her. And out of her willingness to tell the story as she had experienced it and as she understood it, she's reconnected with extended family that she had been cut off from by her parents, and has been, it's a fascinating thing. Tara is no longer a practicing Latter-day Saint, but this is a book that's a testimony in powerful ways to the healing power of community and to principles of Latter-day Saint faith that I think many of us in this room deeply share. I think it's a wonderful contribution to Mormon arts, and she's going to be in New York for the next year, and I hope she will connect with this community in some way. So that's my contribution for the evening, the power of community, and also the importance sometimes of loneliness and being able to stand up and risk loss of the thing that we love most about our community. And it's my conviction, I was very moved by this book, which I connected in many ways to the story I had told in 400 plotting pages about early 19th century women in a house full of female In some ways, Tara's story is a caricature of 19th century Mormonism with a prophetic figure as the controlling patriarch. But it's a kind of, as caricatures can sometimes be, a way of turning us back and seeing things that may not be totally visible when we see the fully rounded historian's portrait of a circumstance. The 19th century, as I've argued, was not the nightmare of abuse that many people have described it, but it was definitely a patriarchal society. And the inspirational part of it, for me, in the work that I did, was the ability of women to find their own voices and to begin to tell their own stories, a task that is far from finished. Thank you.